You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, and one of us is chained. None of us are free, 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 and one of us is chained. None of us are free. There are people in darkness.
All right, well, welcome to the Labor Radio Podcast Network's Wednesday live stream. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab. We focus on labor, political economy, art, and culture. And my co-host tonight is Patrick Dixon. Patrick, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good. Pleased to be joining you, Evan, from about half an inch of snow in Arlington, Virginia. I'm one of the producers of the Labour History Today podcast, and I'm excited about our lineup of guests this evening.
And behind the scenes, we have the one and only Chris Garlock, who is the executive producer, and Harold Phillips is always helping with the social media for the Labor Radio Podcast Network. And we have a great show this evening. Our first guest is Kayla Blado, who is the president of the nonprofit's Professional Employees Union, and she's going to be discussing why white-collar workers need unions and unionization efforts for nonprofit workers. Patrick, could you talk a little bit about our second guest?
Yeah, I've got an equally awesome guest. I'm going to be speaking to Tim Sheard about the Pandemic Nurse's Diary, an exciting new publication from Hardball Press.
Great. And before that, we are going to be sharing a short segment from another one of our Labor Radio podcast partners, Labor Radio, based in Canada, and they have Solidarity News, and so we're going to play that now.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labor.
This is a Radio Labor report recorded on Wednesday, December 16th, 2020. I'm Mark Boulanger. Teachers around the world are working hard to protect their students and open schools safely as the pandemic continues its awful course. They are being supported by unions and labor federations such as Education International. EI is the global union for teachers and other educators. It represents more than 32 million union members in 178 countries. In a recent webinar about the pandemic and teaching, the General Secretary of EI, David Edwards, said the key to safely opening schools is to listen to the teachers.
For years, education systems have been more a casino for investors than a proving ground for innovation. When more than 1 billion students were forced out of schools, millions of teachers adapted to distant practice, the vast majority without the tools, training, or time, but nevertheless persisting. Taking the lead to keep education going for millions of students. There's new evidence that the health crisis is an education crisis. The vast majority. We are in all this together. There will be no recovery or forward momentum unless we build solidarity. And this can't just be the unions or the progressive community, but a global solidarity for a strong public sector that puts people first. Certain groups in the community, but especially teachers, enjoy a level of trust when we speak about the importance of vaccines and delivering the science about their efficacy. As a profession, and as a federation, we are deeply committed to the fight against disinformation.
And that's it. Labor news you can use. You can find our features and daily newscasts at radiolabor.net. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
Welcome back, and very excited to have Kayla Blado be joining us this evening. Kayla, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. It's a very important topic, especially around Washington, D.C. There's so many nonprofit folks. My background is in nonprofit. So could you begin talking a little bit about what is the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union? And since you're the president, what is some of the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, so the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union is a local of IFPTE, the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. And we represent over 30 different nonprofits across the country. We represent workers at think tanks and advocacy groups. I personally work at the Economic Policy Institute as my full-time job. I'm the director of media relations there. And EPI was actually the first unit to organize with NPEU way back in 1998. And since then, we've grown to representing over 30 different units across the country. We represent workers at places like Center for American Progress, Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Community Change. And we just announced a new one yesterday, the Animal Legal Defense Fund. So we're growing. We have a ton of nonprofit workers that want to be part of a union, and we're helping them achieve a more equitable workplace.
Well, we will talk about that, Victory, and congratulations on that.
Thanks.
A lot of people think about nonprofits as being a bunch of do-gooders. And so the first question for someone completely outside of this sector and with little understanding about unions, why are these do-gooders, why do they need a union?
Well, nonprofits are unfortunately part of this capitalistic, exploitative economy that we're all a part of. And even though a lot of them have really great missions, a lot of times they fall short in expressing those pro-labor, progressive worker values in to their own staff. And, especially we know from data that, people are not, having an advanced degree and being in a white collar organization, people are not immune from things like discrimination. And it actually, pay increases actually get worse with the more education that you have. And so having a union is really important to basically making sure that our voice is heard and that there are mechanisms in place for dealing with issues that arise and creating a more equitable and democratic workplace.
I think from my experience in nonprofits, some of the people on the top can make upwards of 100 to 200, 250, or even more than that, $1,000.
Yep.
Yeah, but per year, and then they could be paying associates $30,000 a year, and it's all coming from the same pool of cash that's being raised. Could you talk a little bit about this article you wrote about a year ago in these times on the answer to burnout at work? Isn't this self-care? It's about unionizing.
Yeah, I think we're really seeing that right now during the pandemic, especially. We've seen a surge in workers wanting to organize. I mean, we're all burnt out. We've all been on a million Zoom calls, working from home. And a lot of us, we're lucky, we get to work from home and, but a lot of people have childcare obligations or family responsibilities. But having a union really does create a safeguard and some certainty. And so, and even without the pandemic, there's so many toxic things in nonprofit culture that, you hear from management, maybe to just, relax, or, there's also all sort of people who will want to sell you candles and massages and all that stuff. But that isn't really going to create systemic change and create more power for the workers in order to actually change the issues that are really affecting them. And so we definitely recommend forming a union. That's not to say self-care isn't important. Obviously, it's all super important, taking care of your mental and physical health. But, forming a union is really one way to create that systemic change and rebalance the power at your workplace so that you can actually address some of these issues that are making it such a stressful environment.
The exploitative nature of this, where you have some of these junior associates workers that may not have tenure or just may not be in the management, they believe in the mission, and it's exploitative in the sense that they are working because they believe in the mission, and they are willing to work more than those 40 hours and oftentimes not be compensated. But that's where you have some of the people on top actually taking more than and not really sharing the full pool.
Yeah.
What was your background in nonprofits before you went to your current position?
Yeah, so I've worked in non-union nonprofits as well as union nonprofits. And what you said about particularly young people and other marginalized and vulnerable people basically taking on additional work and then not being compensated for it, that's definitely unique to the nonprofit culture. I think that we're all giving so much of ourselves for the mission of the organization. And to be clear, the reason that we all work at nonprofits is because we support the mission of the organization. There's so many messed up things in the world. And if you can, be part of the solution in your day job, and have that be a core part of your work, then that's amazing. But, we can't be replicating these same problematic, exploitative things that we see in other private sector jobs at our nonprofits at the same time where, publicly preaching against income inequality and racial inequality and that sort of thing. And so, that's definitely, one of the things is the pay inequality that you see in this kind of like guilt tripping people to sacrifice more of themselves for the sake of the mission. And that's definitely, maybe that's not something you'd see in a more traditional union contract, but there are ways that we can try to change the nature and the culture of the organization through organizing and through a contract.
And a lot of the people coming out of college are having very high debt levels, and yet they're still making sometimes very junior salaries, and with the hope that they're doing something right and they can move into a career in this field. And before opening up with Patrick, and I do want to ask you a little bit, a lot of nonprofits are oftentimes, you have a very racially unequal distribution of power, from my experience, where you have a lot of white people who are generally in management, and most of the minorities can oftentimes fall into more operational roles and less decision-making roles. Could you talk a little bit about that type of work that you may be doing with your union and with the NPEU?
Yeah. Racial equity is a huge issue in the nonprofit space. I mean, white supremacy culture infiltrates almost every aspect of nonprofits, and honestly, every single nonprofit that we hear from, that's one of their main issues. And I think there are a lot of ways in which that we've tried to focus and solve this, but pay equity is a huge issue, making sure that people are being paid equally for the same work, creating pathways to promotion and professional development, creating more equitable hiring processes, and making sure that once people are hired, that they feel supported, and that they have professional development and ways to grow. These are all, ways in which I think a union can really add some teeth to it. I mean, we have a lot of organizations that, they will hear from members. They'll come to us and say, our manager tried to do this racial equity committee, and we had all these great ideas, but they were never ever implemented, and there's nothing to actually hold them to it. Well, that's where, when you have a union and you have a legally binding contract that says management has to pay people this amount for diversity, equity, inclusion training, or they have to have X number of trainings a year, that sort of thing. If they're not sticking to that, we're gonna grieve that, and we're gonna make it management's problem that they're not sticking to it. So I think having a union is a really crucial tool in shifting that culture.
Yeah, Patrick, please.
Thank you. Pleased to talk to you, Kayla. I'm from the History podcast, so I guess it's predictable that I'll frame this question in this way, but people in this country and many others put their bodies on the line for decades to fight for first a 10-hour day and then an 8-hour day. And part of the argument that they made was that they could be both safer on their jobs and more productive by working for sort of limited stretches of time. And yet at least from what I've read, I've heard many stories about people being called at all hours, people being available all the time. And while those of us who work from home are fortunate in that there's a certain safety to that, home is work is home is work is home is work, it seems. Is there a union difference as far as these sort of distinctions or these sort of collapsed barriers between the professional life and the private realm?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue, particularly now during the pandemic, and also when a lot of our other workers are working from home. But yeah, we can set up structures and boundaries in the contract. You can say that there are core work hours, and email can only be answered during those core hours, unless it's an emergency. But then, not everything can be an emergency, and that, right now, working from home, we're getting stipends for a lot of our workers to use for internet and cell phone bills, as well as some of our units have been able to get them for mental health resources, so that they can deal with the stress of the pandemic and working from home. And then also just, having kind of a labor management committee that can deal with this stuff, and it might be outside of the contract, but if it's, one particular manager is an issue and they're emailing their employees at all hours of the night, the labor management committee can basically, raise it and say, this manager is causing a huge morale issue with their employees. Like, we need to address this. And I think, in the spirit of a pro worker organization like this, we wouldn't be wearing our employees out, at all hours of the night. So I think there are a variety of tools that we use to address that. And that's only going to become a bigger problem, I think, in the general workforce in the next few years.
And first, I want to apologize, mea culpa. It's Kayla Blado. Sorry about that. I should have,
Rhymes with Play-Doh. Tell everyone that.
my mistake. But to get back onto the topic, the focus on organizing during the pandemic. How do you do this over Zoom? How is this going?
Yes. Well, we're on Zoom right now. Everyone is on Zoom all the time. I mean, a lot of people have family obligations, but those who are able to get away, it's been kind of just a lot of meetings and talking to people about, I think working from home is one thing we just talked about that, what the environment is like. But then when we go back, I mean, we want to, when you have a union, management has a legal obligation to bargain with you over the work environment that you're going to be in. And we want to make sure it's a safe work environment, and that people who rely on public transportation are not exposed, and that people who have childcare issues will be taken care of. And so I think that this is kind of creating a moment that, instead of just hunkering down and focusing on, making it through the next year, I think that this is a real organizing moment for workers, because they want to have a voice and when they come back, because the consequences could be huge if they come back in an unsafe environment.
Could you talk a little bit about the latest victory?
Yeah, so we just went public yesterday with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. We're really excited to have them. They're the first animal rights organization that I know of that it has actually formed a union. So we're really excited to have them. They are a great unit. They're all over the country. And they asked management for voluntary recognition yesterday. And we are hoping, we still haven't heard anything from management yet, but we are hoping that they do the right thing and recognize their workers and don't make them go to the Trump NLRB for a union election.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that process? Maybe there's someone who's going to hear this and is interested in, taking the steps to forming a union. What is that process? Yeah,
so first you want to talk to your coworkers. So maybe talk to a small group of coworkers who you think might be on the same page as you, that they have had some of the same issues, and that you all think that forming a union would really help them. And then basically you want to do your research and find a union that you think could help you organize. And, our union, the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union, is one, but there are many other unions that are organizing nonprofits right now. Reach out to them, see, connect with an organizer. But basically the process is that you're going to be talking to your coworkers and talking to them about the issues that they're having and how those could be solved through a union. And then you're going to have people sign union cards, which basically means that the union is going to represent them legally through a contract. And then you will, if you think that your management is, a progressive environment and they are pro-worker, we always want to ask them to recognize our union first, give them the chance to do the right thing. They can, with a stroke of a pen, they can recognize your union. For those that, choose to, they're more anti-union and they're going to make you jump through some hoops. We file union elections. Basically, that means that you go through the National Labor Relations Board, and then they will mail you a ballot, and then you will vote yes for your union. And if you have a majority of cards, then you will have a union. Basically 2 ways of getting the same thing. The election is a little bit more work, but they will both get you the union if you've done enough organizing on the back end.
And then that's just the beginning, because you still need to get a contract that everyone can agree on, and you need to be willing to walk, which can be very challenging when people are financially distressed. Mm-hmm. So before I go to Patrick again, Chris Garlock shared this quote from Action Squared President Brian Young. I'll just say, for people who are thinking about starting a union at their place of work, but are a little nervous to try, the more nervous you are about the reaction of your organization, the more you probably need a union. Could you just respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, he's right on. There's all these paradoxes in all of this, and people think, maybe if we ask really nicely, management will grant us a union, and if we don't offend them and all these sorts of things. And at the end of the day, it's like, if you had good management, or if you had management that was willing to share power in the first place, you probably wouldn't be in this situation. And so the more freaked out you are about being in a union, the point of a union is to be stronger than the individual. The point of the union is to make sure that bad things don't happen to you, or if they do, then management is held accountable for them. And so I would just urge anyone who's listening who thinks, I'm interested in a union, but I'm a little scared about the process, talk to a union organizer. They'll help you through it. They will help you come up with strategies to make sure that you're as strong as possible, and that you can get a union as quickly and painlessly as possible, and basically be on your path to getting a strong union contract and creating that change that you want.
Great. And we have time for a couple more questions. Patrick, do you have any questions?
Many white-collar workers live on work-provided computers and use work-provided phones. And as you've said, even some of the seemingly most progressive nonprofits don't always seem to be quite as progressive as the slogan. Does this make it complicated for workers coming forward, or for your organizers?
Yes, I would advise you to not use don't use your work computers, don't use your work phones, don't organize on work time. If you're talking to your coworkers, don't use your work Slack or Teams or work email. You want to get everyone's private information. You want to definitely create a private Signal group or WhatsApp group with everyone. Your employer has access to your emails, to everything you're doing on your work technology. So you just want to make sure that you're doing it on private, after work or on lunch breaks, and on your own devices, just to make sure that in case management would retaliate against you, which we all know is illegal, but is hard to enforce, particularly under this administration, you just want to be as safe as possible.
So something that I've thought a lot about I was inside the government, international development, and a lot of international development got hollowed out in the 1990s, and a lot of the contracting, then they created an entire contracting body to help implement, and a lot of it are not for profit, non-government organizations to carry out the functions of these what the government used to do in foreign policy and international development. Meanwhile, a lot of the workers in the nonprofits at the lower levels don't have the union, don't have the protection, don't get the same pay as federal employees, don't get the same healthcare, the pension, all that other stuff. But the people on top of the nonprofits are getting $250,000 a year and things like that. I guess going into 2021 with a new administration and obviously a lot of challenges with nonprofits and foundation funding, what is your, I guess, what's your hope and what are some of the opportunities that we can keep ensuring that we can unionize this entire sector that is oftentimes doing services for the government?
Yeah, well, I would first of all urge the government to not keep outsourcing jobs that should be, done by the government into the nonprofit industrial complex. I think that, and then the jobs that are created in the nonprofit space, make sure that those are good jobs and that people are being paid equitably for them. No one should be living in poverty or have to take on more than one job in order to make it in DC. And so we want to make sure that, those places can be easily unionized and that management doesn't fight those unions, and that they also adopt, some of the maybe good pay structures and that sort of thing that that the government already has in place.
Great. So we're coming up at the half of the hour, and you're always welcome to stay with us. But in closing, how can people learn more about this union and just going forward?
Sure. They can find us online. Our website is npeu.org, and you can find us on social media. We're on Twitter at Nonprofit Union and Instagram as well. And you can also find us on Facebook at the Nonprofit Professional Employees Union. Please reach out if you have any questions. We can talk to you or we can connect you with one of our other friends at another union who might be able to help you.
Awesome. And do you have time to stick around or do you have to get
Yeah,
moving?
definitely.
Okay, cool. Well, we are going to go into our music for the middle half, which is a labor song from the pandemics related to our next guest. And let me just put that on right now.
Close your eyes, time to sleep now. You have someone to call to. The pain is gone, it will keep now. For a patient and nurse to care for you. The ward is still, no one walking, no more tests to get through. Lights are low, no one talking, just a patient and nurse to care for you. May no one die till tomorrow. No doctor page, no alarms to leave the family with no sorrow. Just a
And that was Lullaby by the Pandemics. And we're lucky now to be joined by Tim Sheard, the writer of that song and the editor of the Pandemic Nurse's Diary, an exciting new publication from Hardball Press. Can you show us a copy of the Pandemic? There we go. Pleased to have you joining us, Tim. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Now, I was lucky enough to read the Pandemic Nurse's Diary recently, and it includes a lot of, in some cases, quite harrowing stories from the early stages of the pandemic, where we just see really quite haphazard conditions in many cases. And I know you were a nurse for 40 years. Did these stories surprise you when people started reaching out to you? And can you tell us a bit about how this publication came to be?
Yeah, these stories were quite shocking. Having worked in intensive cares for 40 years, I'd never been in war, and the nurses and other healthcare workers were facing battlefield conditions in the spring in New York City. There were literally bodies piling up in temporary morgues outside the hospital in tents. So it was quite shocking for me, but it was even more shocking to the workers because they had to go in every day back into this battlefield, and it was quite traumatic for them.
And how did you go about, can you tell us a bit about the process? How did you go about assembling this diverse collection of stories from nursing professionals?
Sure. Well, I've been in contact with a number of friends in various hospitals around New York City, and one nurse in particular, Nurse T, who is fond of my writing, sent me some text messages about how difficult it was, what she was facing, all the codes, 3 patients dying on one shift. She'd never seen that before. And she wrote to me and she wrote, "OMG, Tim, when this is all over, you've got to write a book about it." And I said, "No, Nurse T, you've got to write the book." So I used my experience as a mentor to writers, because I've been a mentor through the National Writers Union for decades. And I helped her develop her voice, flesh out her diary entries, and then format them into a real readable book.
You okay there? And I've read many of these stories. I'm sure a lot of people have seen nurses and doctors interviewed on CNN and in the newspapers and everywhere else. But can you give people a bit of a taste of how is it different when workers are not subject to the editors at AOL, Time Warner, or whoever else? What makes it really different?
Of course, during the pandemic, there were a number of interviews in the mainstream press. You read them in the New York Times and the Guardian, and they were, for the most part, heartfelt. They certainly were honest, but the staff really were not able to express some of the depths of the anxiety, the dangers that they faced, the horrific conditions, and also some of the failings of our healthcare system, because healthcare, is not financed the way it should be. In other words, when it comes to spending the money from the taxes that are collected, healthcare often comes last, especially communities of color and poor communities. And so they really were not prepared for this avalanche of patients. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the supplies, and this was not reported really fully in the mainstream press. And so I felt strongly that through Nurse T, we could get this message out to the public.
And many of these professionals describe their patients, describe their daily routines. I mean, in some cases, they describe the trash bags that they have to punch holes in to put over themselves to protect themselves. They don't describe themselves as superheroes, and this is a rhetoric that's taken on. I drive past GW Hospital sometimes, George Washington University Hospital, and must be a 40-foot sign on the wall that says something along the lines of superheroes work here, and there's a picture of a nurse. It may be a nurse, it may be a doctor wearing a cape. Has this rhetoric served nurses well, being described in this way?
I don't think it's fair. I mean, it's true that they're heroic, but really what the staff are doing, and they'll tell you, they're just doing their job. They're doing the job they've been doing their whole life. And what's terrible about it and difficult about it is they're not given the resources that they need to really do their job well. So yes, they're courageous, but when you talk to a nurse, talk to a doctor, they're just doing their job. They don't feel like they're superheroes. Let's put it that way.
Hmm. I know, Evan, you've got a question, and we've also got a clip that you've helped prepare for us. If you don't mind doing that up, please.
Good to see you again. And Tim and I collaborated a little bit on some of the essays to create some audio essays. And so I'm just going to pull a short clip from one of the essays that is focusing, it's called the ICU. And a friend of mine got me in touch with a nurse from Riverside in California who was able to read the essay. And so she also was profoundly affected by these essays. And this is her voice, Kim Hoyer from Riverside. So this is a very short clip.
With our fearless nurse's aide Lily helping, I settle the patient into bed, adjust the intravenous infusion, and tie his wrist to the bed frame to keep him from pulling out his breathing tube. Finally, I look for the first time into the man's face. It is a handsome face. It is a face that once laughed and smiled and winked at his children. I know he will laugh no more. The cold ones always code. They always die.
So obviously it's pretty powerful to, I mean, the healthcare workers are constantly, at the front lines of helping people on the verge of passing. I guess looking at this book, Tim, I really appreciate the fact that culture influences policy and politics as much as anything, art and literature. And so how can we help in promoting this book? Obviously we're here talking about it now, but I guess going forward in the coming months and years, how can we get more focus of labor in our entertainment and in our culture and those type of things?
Well, it would be wonderful if more of the major labor unions, local and national, promoted the labor arts, because the labor arts give voice to labor's message and labor's needs, and not only our message, but also our integrity, our value, our worth, and that comes through labor arts, whether it's poetry, song, music, painting. And if the unions would promote them, for example, they all have monthly newsletters. And if their editors were allowed to write about labor arts and what's coming out and give it to their members, then their members could participate and enjoy this art, and it would help spread the word. And it's a great challenge just getting my book reviewed in the nursing unions. It's a huge challenge. And I don't know quite why it's difficult, but many of them resist writing about and reviewing or supporting labor arts. So as much as we can promote that from the AFL down to the locals, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, we have to create our own entertainment, our own production, our own publishing houses. So it's some great work you're doing with Hardball Press.
Thank you.
We also have Kayla Blado from the from the Non-Profit Employees Union on the line. Kayla, what do you think about what you've been hearing?
The audio you played and Tim's book, it's just so powerful. It makes me so sad, and then it makes me so mad. Like, none of this needed to happen. I mean, my organization EPI, where I work, we talked about, Trump could have used the Defense Authorization Act, or Defense Production Authorization Act to help, manufacture better PPE for healthcare workers. It's just, I agree with Tim saying, calling them superheroes, I think almost kind of skirts the issue that they're humans. I mean, would you want to be working in this environment? Would you want your family or friends to be working in this environment? I mean, it's just, it's horrific that we expect so much from workers. And I think, Tim talking about labor arts, I think is really important. I think I guess I hadn't even thought about that recently. It just seems like, you know, such an urgent crisis that there isn't any time for art or music or reflection or anything, but that's probably one of the most important ways to get through such a crisis. So I'm really looking forward to reading your book and getting more engaged in the labor arts space.
Tim?
Thank you, Kayla. And you know, these songs I've written, I wrote these songs for my beloved coworkers. And through the spring, I said to them on the phone and over and again, I've never been more proud to be a nurse, and I've never loved my coworkers so much. And I think it's important, you know, in New York at 7 p.m., people would hang out their windows and applaud and bang pots to thank the essential workers, all the essential workers, you know, the people in transit and in the food service. And the more that you can do through your union and through all of us through our unions to affirm the value of these workers, then the more they're going to be able to negotiate for their power, because they have to, you know, convince the public that they're worth their contract.
I also like, I did get this book, The Man Who Fell from the Sky, and it's a Bill Fletcher Jr. We had him on the live stream on around election week, and you're also doing fiction. So could you talk a little bit about the fiction that you've written with the Lenny Moss series?
Yeah, thank you. So
also a writer yourself, not just a publisher and nurse.
So thank you. So I have 9 mystery novels in a series, a crime series, and it's set in a fictional hospital, of course, since that's where I work. And the amateur sleuth, the detective, is a hospital custodian and a union shop steward, a very militant union shop steward. And the way the story goes, which is typical in crime stories, is that an innocent person is arrested for a murder. In this case, a hospital worker, probably a black worker. And so his friends go to their best steward, who's always getting them out of trouble, even when the trouble is like with their wife, not with the boss. And he says, you got to get him out of jail. And he says, what am I going to do? He says, you've got to find the killer. And so he becomes a detective. And the nice thing about it is that it's an enjoyable story, but in the course of the story, as a shop steward, he always engages with the bosses on some conflict, you know, some issue, some labor issue, whether it's worker safety or overwork or negotiating unfair firing. And so through the course of reading, you know, an enjoyable novel, you learn about what unions do and how they advocate for their workers.
And I like how you got into publishing because you published this with another organization and it went out of print. So you just took it into your own hands, which is great.
Well, that's what we do when we're organizers, right? We're organizing, and if one campaign fails, and we try another tactic. You hit a brick wall, you go over it, you go under it. You know, you don't give up.
One of the things we mentioned earlier when we were talking to Kayla was the level of burnout among non-profit union employees. I understand, I recall at the end of the Pandemic Nurses Diary, you have a section on meditations. Can you tell us a bit about that, Tim?
Sure. Well, meditation is one way to try and work through your feelings of anger or sadness, your sense of isolation. And through the meditation, the exercises, you imagine a scenario where you can get past it. For example, when a beloved patient dies, you imagine speaking at the funeral, which you can't do because of COVID, but you imagine speaking to the family and embracing the family and hugging the family. And in that thought process and that meditation, it helps you work through the grief at the loss of so many patients. So there are these meditations that help you get through many of these difficult feelings of guilt, even for surviving when your coworkers died. And there are writing exercises where you can write out your thoughts and your feelings. You can write a letter to a beloved patient. You can write a letter to a family member. You can write a letter to a coworker who's died. And all these ways are helping you to get past that trauma that so many have experienced.
it's not the brass tacks of sort of dollars and cents, but is there a way that the union can be a part of this recovery on the part of workers?
Sure. Well, I'm not a very good capitalist, Patrick. So I tend to discount my books pretty heavily when unions buy them. So if a union wants to buy copies to give to their members, I discount it way down. So it's really, my goal is to get as many books out to workers as I can. And so if dropping the price means more people get to read it, then I'm certainly happy to do it. They can call me up, they can email me to Hardball Press, and I'm happy to cut them a very, very good deal.
So you also have children's stories that you've written about, and could you talk a little bit about some of those projects?
Sure. Well, when we teach children with story, it's important sometimes to teach them about labor and about social justice, which we see more and more. We've seen more Black Lives Matter stories for children, gender rights for children. And so I have labor and social justice rights for children. They're all in English and Spanish, so they're bilingual, so they reach a wide community. And I have a enchanting Christmas story called Good Guy Jake, which is based on a true story. A sanitation worker in New York City was fired because he was taking toys out of the trash. And he took the toys home and he repaired them and painted them and he gave them to children at a local shelter at Christmas time. And it's against city regs. So we wrote a story where the union files for arbitration, and even though it's a losing case, they win it because the children come with their toys and they testify on behalf of the worker that Jake, the sanitation worker, taught them to believe in Christmas. So this is a way to teach young children about how unions advocate for workers and what real justice is about. And again, if unions want to get these books for their members, they're very, very inexpensive if they want to, get them in bulk. Good Guy Jake.
We need to get that book in national curriculum for all elementary schools. Indoctrinate them early.
Teach them early.
Yes, that's a better word. Absolutely.
I'm sorry. Kayla, many of your members might not have necessarily experienced quite the same sort of frontline strains as the nurses that Tim refers to, but is there some, I don't know, do you feel that, is there some sort of meditative process for many white collar workers who are working from home to sort of transitioning to whatever happens next?
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful. We're all facing really stressful environments right now. I think, any type of meditation and then, kind of like working that into the self-care narrative, but doing it for a reason to kind of create strength and stability so that you can continue doing your job and continue with supporting other workers and your own union, I think is really important. I also think that, when Tim is talking about these workers and these like horrific environments, I think nonprofit workers feel, really fortunate that we don't have, that we're not being worn down day in and day out by these horrible work environments of being in a hospital during COVID. But I think, we're always looking for opportunities to show solidarity and support for essential workers. And, and we might have different capacity or different talents that we could share that might be beneficial. So if anyone listening wants to reach out, we're definitely open to working together on any sort of essential worker initiatives that could help strengthen unions right now.
Chris Garlock is weighing in and just wanted to kind of wonder, Tim, about why art is important to this movement.
That's a lovely question. Lovely question. There's a very smart professor in Chicago, Northeastern University in Chicago, Tim Libretti, who teaches literature. And he says that the story, the novel, the short story, the poem even, the story is an imaginary way to solve a real social problem. that we solve our problems, whether it's finding love, finding a job, finding justice. We work out these problems through fiction, and they teach us how to deal with social problems. And art is essential from the earliest pre-literate days, when people told stories, when the storyteller was cherished for the ability to, educate and enrapture an audience. Stories are so important for informing and educating and inspiring about social justice issues and how we can address them, how we can solve them, how we can conquer them. So the arts are really so important, and they deserve much more, obviously, support from all the institutions.
How do you write fiction when real life is so crazy right now?
It's true. It's hard to write fiction. So it's curious. At my age, 72, I've made the transition apparently from writing novels to writing melody and song lyrics. And it is a different kind of writing, but it's just another way of telling a story and touching people's heart. Because a good story, you want a good story to move someone. You want it to make them laugh or cry. You want them to feel something. And songs do the similar thing. So it's all of a piece. And where does it come from? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. But this creative spirit, it just bubbles up out of some mysterious place in our soul. And many people during this COVID, when they're shut in, have discovered creative abilities they didn't know they had. It's been one of the, few positive things that's come out of it.
Have you got any hints, Kayla? Is there anything that you've discovered that has?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kayla.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think it resonates that it's kind of something in you that drives you to pursue arts. And I think it's a similar kind of drive that causes our members to pursue types of social justice initiatives. And I think probably what drives a lot of us to be in labor as well, it's some type of connection to other people and expression of our own power, and that we don't normally get an opportunity to do in kind of day-to-day life.
And you've been taking music lessons as well, Tim.
Yes, music. Yeah, I've been taking guitar lessons from a fellow in New Orleans, and he's such a gifted teacher that he's just opened up the whole world of melody and syncopation and rhyme, which I didn't know was there. But he unlocked this box, and it's just been bubbling up. I started a new song today about what is a good life? What is a good life all about? Is it all about me, or is it about us? Is it about giving, or is it about taking? And the songs, they just write themselves if I just let them flow. It's just extraordinary.
And the process was really interesting on how you put this album together, the pandemics during COVID. Could you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. Well, with the COVID restrictions and the social distancing, to form a band, we could never actually play together as a group. It was just too dangerous. So I would bring in a singer, play the acoustic guitar, and lay down one vocal track, and then bring in another singer, or I might have two vocalists, and one would sit by the open window, masked, and then when the singer would unmask, sing the song, and then mask back on. And then I'd take my laptop and my microphone, and I'd take it to the bass player 6 blocks away, and he'd lay down the bass track. And then I'd take all the tracks to the drummer, and he'd go to his studio, and he'd lay down the drum tracks. And some musicians, they had to email it through the cloud, or I'd send them the song, and they'd lay down violin tracks or slide guitar tracks, and they'd send me those tracks, and then I'd integrate them all through GarageBand. And so we have a virtual band that's never actually played together, and we won't be able to play together until we're vaccinated, but we still managed to put together a heck of a good album.
So we have about 1 minute left until we get to our 2 minutes in labor history. So I guess, could you talk how people can find your books, and how people can support labor writers and labor music?
Sure. If they go to hardballpress.com, throw in the hardball, right on the home page, they'll see a link to the Pandemic Nurses Diary, they'll see a link to the music, and all the music is on my page. It's all free to listen to. And then there are lots of books, stories, and also organizing tools. I have some really powerful tools for organizing unions and for building union solidarity for internal organizing as well. I call them power tools for labor. So if you go to Hardball Press, you'll find some great resources. And again, steep discounts, because I'm not in this for the money.
Tim Sheard, Hardball Press, thank you very much. Kayla Blado from the Nonprofit Employees Union, and Patrick Dixon co-hosting, and Chris Garlock behind the scenes. We are going to go into labor history in 2, and then we're going to have a station identification for 1 minute. Everyone is welcome to join us. And then we usually have a debrief at 8 p.m. where members of the Labor Radio Podcast Network jump on. You're more than welcome to stay as guests. And yeah, we're going to go into labor history then.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1995. That was the day machinists at Boeing ended their 69-day strike. 33,000 workers won increased pay and health benefits. They also won job protections against subcontracting. Contractual clauses against subcontracting were important, especially given the fact that NAFTA had just been passed 2 years earlier. The contract specified that the union be given 3 months' notice regarding any plans to subcontract out work. It also incentivized keeping work in-house by calling for increased benefits to laid-off workers and mandatory retraining and re-employment of workers displaced by subcontracting. These provisions came after IAM members rejected 2 previous contract offers. They were furious at the initial demands for concessions, even as Boeing executives were awarded multi-million-dollar stock options. At the time, the IAM and its members lauded this as a total victory. For a few years, Boeing abided by the contract they signed. Subsequently, Boeing bosses have routinely violated their agreements. Many of these provisions were lost in the 2002 contract and then recaptured in 2008. But the next contract negotiations witnessed a renewed fight for job security. Over the past 2 decades, Boeing workers have seen massive layoffs, subcontracting, pension freezes and phase-outs, and relocation of their work. All while the company rakes in billions of dollars in profits, gets lucrative tax breaks and subsidies, and has close to 5,000 back orders for planes. Subcontracting clauses are important, but can only work when they are enforced. Victories like the winning strike in 1995 can serve as a reminder for workers today that if they stand together in solidarity, they can win better wages, hours, and conditions at the bargaining table.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are